Hello, my name is Buki Fatona. I am a doctoral researcher at the University of Oxford. Welcome to Phil-Sci-Theo, an 8-part discussion series on topics in the intersect of philosophy of science and religion. We are at St Hugh's, one of University of Oxford's colleges. With me is Professor Adrian Moore, who is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford and Fellow and Tutor in Philosophy here at St Hugh's. Professor Moore, thank you so much for joining us on this docu-series Phil-Sci-Theo.
Thank you for the invitation.
I first came across your work in the BBC Radio 4's series on the infinite. And as this docu-series is on topics in the intersect of philosophy of mind, religion, and science, the infinite is one such topic, is highly relevant. So let's go there. And we begin at the start with the Greek thinkers. And the first question is, what was the concept of the infinite? Why was it so important and so fascinating for ancient Greek thinkers?
I think the first thing that you need to emphasize when you're talking about the Greeks is that there's a little bit of a reversal from what we're accustomed to these days. Ordinarily, when people use the word infinite these days, they have in mind something positive, something to be revered or respected, something that you stand in some kind of awe to. For the Greeks, it was a pejorative term. The infinite was something to be distrusted or something that caused confusion and paradox. And there's an old adage that's often bandied about, which is that the Greeks abhorred the infinite. And like a lot of these adages, it's an oversimplification. I mean, when you're looking at the history in any kind of detail, you soon realize what an oversimplification it is. But nevertheless, there's a significant kernel of truth in it. And for various reasons, they were uncomfortable with the infinite. They found it puzzling, they found it paradoxical. They discovered a lot of the fundamental paradoxes of the infinite that still exercise people 2,500 years later. And as far as possible, tried to make sense of the world in finite terms. And whenever it seemed to them that they couldn't, whenever it looked as if for one reason or another they had to invoke the infinite, this was problematical for them, and they resisted it as far as possible.
And that leads to Aristotle, the ancient Greek natural philosopher. He recognizes potential infinite and draws a distinction between it and actual infinite. What is this distinction?
Aristotle, in a way, was playing the role of conciliator because he shared the Greeks' suspicion of the infinite. He could perfectly well understand why so many of his predecessors had tried to ignore the infinite or tried to repudiate the infinite, on the one hand. On the other hand, he thought that whether we liked it or not, there were contexts in which we just did have to think in terms of the infinite. So, for example, he would have said that time was infinite in both directions. He would have insisted that the universe was infinitely old, that it had an infinite past, and he would have said that there was an infinite future as well, awaiting the universe. So the distinction that he draws between the actual infinite and the potential infinite is a way of him trying to have his cake and eat it, and a way of trying to explain why we do sometimes have to acknowledge the infinite and why we nevertheless are right to be suspicious of it in other contexts. And so, roughly speaking, the idea is that the potential infinite is the good infinite and the actual infinite is the bad infinite. So the potential infinite is the infinite that we have to recognize, that we have to acknowledge. The actual infinite is the infinite that we're rightly suspicious of. And the way that Aristotle drew this distinction goes back to what I was saying about time. Remember I said that Aristotle thought that time was infinite. And he was able to accommodate that in his terms by saying, okay, so what this means is that time is potentially infinite. And the potential infinite is the kind of infinite that is spread out over time. So time itself is the paradigmatic example. He would have said that there were infinitely many numbers as well, because the process of counting is a process that takes time. To count in a way is to measure time. And again, we can think of that as a kind of potential infinity. The infinity of the numbers is something that's spread out over time, as you realize if you start trying to count them. And of course, what happens if you start trying to count all the numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., what happens is that you never finish. There's no such thing as coming to the end of that process. And for Aristotle, that is indicative of a potential infinity. The actual infinity would be a kind of infinity that was there all at once. And that's what he repudiates. So let's turn our attention from time to space. And now we find that Aristotle says the opposite of what he wanted to say about time. Time, he was happy to accept, was infinite because it was potentially infinite. Space, according to Aristotle, has to be finite, because if it were infinite, it would be actually infinite. The infinity would be there all at once, because space is there at any given time, is all there at any given time. So potential infinity, good; actual infinity, bad. Time is infinite because it's potentially infinite. Space is finite because if it were infinite, it would have to be actually infinite, and that would be bad news.
Thank you. This raises for me a question on time and in Aristotle's work. You said he thinks that the infinite time stretches out infinitely on either end. So where does that sit with his idea of a first cause? If time stretches back ad infinitum, where in that continuum is the first cause?
Yes, it does look like a puzzle, doesn't it? Because Aristotle does believe that there's a first cause, and when you hear the phrase first cause, a lot of people, I think, would naturally think in terms of something like the Big Bang, or what initiated the Big Bang. And that would immediately suggest that the universe was only finitely old. Maybe you can go back a long way, but eventually you hit the point at which it began. And we might then think of the first cause as whatever made it begin. But we have to stop thinking in those terms. That's not the kind of causation that Aristotle had in mind. The first cause is something that exists outside time. And one way to think of this is in terms of various different kinds of causation that Aristotle recognized. So there is the simple sort of causation that you get when one billiard ball hits another and the second one moves off as a result. But there's also the kind of causation that you get when somebody is acting for a purpose. So, why did you do that? Why did you just wave your arm? Well, because I was trying to attract his attention, let's say. And it's almost as if the cause in that case is coming after the effect. The action is directed towards something that's still to come. The waving occurs before the other person's attention is attracted, and yet it's the attracting of the attention that is causing the waving in a way. So we can see how something that isn't predating the events in history can nevertheless still in some sense be a cause of those events. And that's the way in which we have to think of Aristotle's first cause. So it does leave him free to say that the universe is infinitely old and that it has always been in existence.